Exodus 3, 1 through 12. Meanwhile, Moses was shepherding the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire within a bush. As Moses looked, he saw that the bush was on fire, but was not consumed. So Moses thought, I must go over and look at this remarkable sight. Why isn't the bush burning up? When the Lord saw that Moses had gone over to look, God called out to him from the bush, Moses, Moses. Here I am, he answered. Do not come closer, he said. Remove the sandals from your feet, for where you are standing is holy ground. Then he continued, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt and have heard them crying out because of their oppressors. I know about their sufferings, and I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them from that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. The territory of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. So because the Israelites' cry for help has come to me, and I have also seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them, therefore, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh so that you may lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses asked God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He answered, I will certainly be with you, and this will be a sign to you that I am the one who sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will all worship God at this mountain.
Thanks, Rebecca. Have you ever felt completely unqualified for something? Maybe you had the thought, I don't think I have the skills to do that, nor do I have the experience. Or maybe you even felt like you lacked the confidence to take that step. Well, let me tell you a story of a man named Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson was raised in a broken home, struggling with abuse and neglect. He had little education, and as a teenager, he was lost in a world of pain and confusion. Yet despite feeling unqualified in every way, Bill heard a call from God to serve children in the poorest neighborhoods of New York City. With no formal training or resources, Bill started out what would become the largest Sunday school program in the world. Today, Metro World Child reaches over 200,000 children globally, offering hope and the message of Jesus to those in desperate need. Bill Wilson's story is a powerful reminder that God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. And this morning, we're going to hear a similar story, but one that happened a long time ago. Before we dive into Moses and the scene of him checking out the burning bush and hearing his name called by God Himself, we need to gain some context as to why God is reaching out to Moses in the first place. So let's start here. The book of Exodus opens with a reminder of God's promise to Abraham. And at that time, the Israelites had grown into a large and thriving nation in Egypt. Chapter 1 tells us in verse 7, but the Israelites were fruitful, increased rapidly, multiplied, and became extremely numerous so that the land was filled with them. At first glance, that growth might seem like a blessing, and it was. It was a blessing, that growth for the Israelites. But it wasn't a blessing to the new Pharaoh. He didn't know anything about Joseph's legacy, nor did he know about the goodwill the Israelites had with Egypt. But there is something that he did know, and that was that the rapid expansion of the Israelites posed a threat. He thought that the Israelites might join an enemy in rebellion. He feared that because that could bring Egypt to its knees. And so he came up with a solution, and it was oppression. And so Pharaoh decides to enslave the Israelites, forcing them into hard labor. He hoped that by exhausting them physically and emotionally, that he could halt their growth. He could stop them from expanding and growing bigger, and maybe that fear that he had would go out the window. But the fascinating thing was that the oppression didn't stop the Israelites. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. And so Pharaoh, seeing this, he escalates his effort. He takes things to the next level. So he orders the Hebrew midwives to kill every baby boy born to the Israelites. However, these midwives, they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh, so they defied his orders. And in his anger, Pharaoh decides to escalate things even more, to take things to another level because of these midwives and their disobedience. So he issues an even more horrifying decree. And it was this: to take all newborn Hebrew boys and throw them into the Nile River. Now, I agree that's pretty dark, right? To take all the new Hebrew boys born to their nation and throw them into the Nile. Well, in chapter 2, we're introduced to a baby boy born to a Hebrew family. His mother recognized something special about him, and so she hid him for 3 whole months. But until she could no longer hide him, she decides that she needs to do something. So she places him in a basket, walks to the Nile, and leaves him on the bank in the reeds. Who should be the one to find the boy? It's none other than Pharaoh's daughter, who took pity on him and brought him in to be raised as her own. Now, I want to stop for just a second because I want us to think about this. The very person, Pharaoh's horrifying decree that he created, that was designed to destroy people like this boy, he ended up becoming a part of Pharaoh's household, to be raised in privilege and royalty. I think it's pretty interesting how God works. As Moses grew, he couldn't ignore the suffering of his people. One day, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, and in a moment of anger, he kills that Egyptian. And because of that decision, he has to flee Egypt. He has to flee everything that he knew, and he settles in a place called Midian, where he becomes a shepherd. For 40 years, Moses lived far removed from his previous life of royalty in Egypt, to everything that he knew. To the world, it might have seemed like his story was over, but God was preparing him for something far greater. And that's what brings us to our text this morning. So I want us to look at Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. This is what it says. Meanwhile, Moses was shepherding the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire within a bush. As Moses looked, he saw that the bush was on fire, but it wasn't consumed. So Moses thought, I must go over and look at this remarkable sight. Why isn't the bush burning up? When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called out to him from the bush, Moses, Moses. Here I am, he answered. Now I want us to notice that Moses wasn't doing anything special when God showed up. And I want us to take note that Moses wasn't someone special. He was just a Hebrew man. working as a shepherd, and he was just going about his normal life. Then, on this average day out of nowhere, Moses sees a bush on fire, which is strange enough, you would think. But here's the crazy part. The bush, it wasn't burning up. The fire was there, but the bush stayed intact. It didn't turn to ashes. This is what I want us to take away from these first 4 verses here, is that God shows up when we are just living life. I want to hit you with that again. God shows up when we are just living life. When we are going about our business, and when we least expect it, God shows up. That's what he did for Moses. And again, Moses wasn't doing anything special, nor was he someone special. I think for many of us, we tend to believe when God calls us or wants to do something in our lives that it's going to happen in some super dramatic, big moment. But God often speaks to us in the middle of our normal lives. At home, while you're watching TV, at work, while you're drafting up an email, in our friendships, through a conversation, maybe even in the gym as you're performing a squat. And yes, even at Hy-Vee when you're searching for the nicest oranges. We don't have to be doing something amazing for God to show up in our lives. And we don't have to be a certain somebody. God often calls us when we're least expecting it and in the normalcy of our lives. And I love that he does that. You see, I remember when I first started out here at the Ridge for Junkyard as the youth director, it was the normal Wednesday night. There was nothing exceptional. It wasn't a super special night. It was normal. But on this night, I found myself feeling completely unqualified to lead the ministry. There was nothing that went wrong that night. It was a great night. But I just felt like I wasn't good enough to be leading. And I remember feeling so discouraged. But before everyone left that night, I remember one of our leaders stopped me. And out of nowhere, he told me this. He said, "Todd, you're the perfect leader for Junkyard. You're the right person to lead this ministry." And for me, in that moment, I felt God reveal himself to me. And it was in a very personal way. But look, I get it. You might be sitting here thinking, that's great for you, Todd. But I don't hear God speaking to me like that. And if that's you, I want to encourage you. God might be calling you in ways that feel small or even unexpected. And sometimes it's hard to believe that God speaks to us directly, but he does. And he is calling you by name, just as he called Moses. It might not be through a burning bush, but God is still present in the everyday moments of our lives. And I want to challenge you with this, to be open to the ways that God might speak to you. Whether it's a sudden thought, a quiet whisper, or even a moment of clarity. That's what he does. I want to bring us to Exodus chapter 3, verse 4. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called out to him from the bush, "Moses, Moses." When Moses saw the burning bush, he was curious. Naturally, right? This is a bush that's not burning up. It's not turning to ashes. It's staying together. Who wouldn't check that out? But as Moses approaches the bush, that's when this happened. God called Moses by name. He called him by name. He didn't send a message in the wind. He didn't say, "Hey, you there. Come here. Hey, you." No, he called out specifically, "Moses, Moses." I think God did this because he wanted Moses to know, without a shadow of doubt, that he was talking to him, that he was calling him to something great. I love this story of Moses and his encounter with God because it always reminds me of my own story. Back in 2011, I had the opportunity to work at a Christian camp outside of Branson, Missouri as a high school leader. I was new to the faith and I really didn't understand how to read the Bible a whole lot. I didn't know a whole lot about God. And I was very unsure if I'd be able to lead others seeking to go deeper in their faith. And when I got there, I realized that I was surrounded by other leaders who grew up in the faith and who seemed to understand a lot about God. Almost immediately, I felt completely unqualified to be there. And it weighed on me heavily. I doubted if I should have even been there in the first place, or if I could even fulfill what I committed to fulfill. It wasn't until I met this 7th grade boy named Charlie. One day I walked Charlie to his cabin, and before he entered, he looked back and he said this. He said, "Hey, Todd, I want to share this with you. This morning at breakfast, I saw you walking, and so I prayed and asked God about you." Do you want to know what he said? I was so taken back. I was like, "Okay, sure, Charlie. What did he say?" He said, "You have a good heart." For me, everything changed in that moment by hearing this from that boy. My whole camp experience as a leader changed right then and there. I believed that God was using Charlie to speak directly to me, to tell me that I was enough just as I was, because he was with me. I felt unqualified, and in a lot of ways, I was. I was so unqualified to be there. But God showed up and called me personally, just like God called Moses by name. You see, God does this because he knows us, and he wants us to know that he knows us, both individually and personally. Even when we feel small, even when we feel unimportant, even when we feel unqualified. He knows our fears, he knows our dreams, our desires, and he knows our struggles. And still, he calls us to be a part of his plan, just like he called Moses. But I think the struggle for a lot of us, myself included, is that too often we respond the same way that Moses did. Verse 11, Moses asked God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Doesn't that sound familiar? Don't we tend to do that? God calls us to do something. We hear what it is, and we respond with something like, "Oh, I don't know, God. That doesn't quite fit my personality. I don't think I want to do that." Or maybe it's like, "Oh, I don't know, God. That seems like a little too uncomfortable for me." Or maybe it's, "I don't know, God. I just don't think that I am strong enough to do something like that." But here's the thing about God. He knows what's best. Moses wasn't sure he was the right person, but God still chose him. God chose him. Maybe he thought he was too small, too weak. Maybe he thought he was unqualified. Maybe he thought to his previous mistakes and the decisions that he made, and he thought there's no possible way that I could be good enough to be called by God for such an enormous task. And maybe you felt like that too. Like you're not good enough, or you're not sure if you can do what God is asking you to do. But here's what I want us to know. God didn't choose Moses because Moses was great. God chose Moses because God is great. God didn't choose Moses because Moses was great. God chose him because God is great. Sometimes for us, we think God can't use us because we're not perfect, because we made too many bad decisions, too many mistakes, so we can't possibly be worthy enough to be called by God. But the truth is, God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. Moses wasn't perfect, but God chose him. And the same is true for you and for me. God will use us, but not because we're perfect, but because he is perfect and works through imperfect people like us. And that's a gift. I don't know about you, but I love that. I love that opportunity. And here's what I love about God's response to Moses. Listen to this. Verse 12, he answered, I will certainly be with you. And this will be the sign to you that I am the one who sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will all worship God at this mountain. I want you to hear that again, just the beginning part. He answered, I will certainly be with you. I love this response to God because he doesn't hear Moses and say, oh, okay, you don't want to do it? That's cool, man, that's cool. I got someone else. He doesn't say that. And he doesn't tell Moses off either. Instead, his response is affirming. He says, I will certainly be with you. In other words, don't worry, Moses. I got you. I've got you. I'm with you. Think about how reassuring that is. God didn't just give Moses a task and leave him on his own. He promised to go with him every step of the way, and it's the same for us. God doesn't call us to do things on our own. He promises to be with us, to help us, to guide us, and to protect us each and every step of the way. Whatever God is calling you to do, whether it's standing up for someone, speaking the hard truth, sharing the gospel, holding a fellow believer accountable, or even praying out loud for someone, remember, God is right there with you. And that's what makes you qualified to accept his call, is that he's with you. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to imagine you're holding a small flickering candle in the middle of a dark room. You might think your light is too small to make a difference, but when God calls you out in a step of faith, it's like he breathes on that flame, and suddenly your small candle becomes a powerful torch that pierces through the darkness, illuminating places you never thought possible. That's what God does when he calls us. He takes our ordinary lives and he uses them for his extraordinary purposes. So the question is, what is God calling you to do? It might not be something big and dramatic. It might be something as simple as reaching out to a neighbor or encouraging a coworker, or maybe like Mike said, get involved in a ministry. Whatever it is, don't disqualify yourself because you feel unqualified. Remember, God calls you in the ordinary moments of your life. Look for him. Remember, he knows you personally and calls you by name. Remember, he doesn't call you because you're perfect. He calls you because he is perfect. And remember this, he promises to be with you every step of the way. Like Moses, you might be tempted to ask, who am I? Who am I, God, to do what you're calling, what you're asking me to do? Who am I? But God's answer is the same for you as it was for Moses. I will certainly be with you. I'll be with you. If you're here today and you're not sure about all this, maybe you've never heard God speak to you or even wondered if he's real, I want to invite you to take a moment and ask God to reveal himself to you. You don't have to have all the answers or even believe everything right now, but just ask, God, if you're real, would you show me? It's a simple step of faith, and I believe he's ready to meet you where you are. And as he does, remember this, God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. Pray with me.